Adolescence can be a wonderful time for development in all areas. However, it is also a time for intense emotions. So it's very critical to differentiate between what is typical behavior and what could be seriously troubling in terms of emotions. Self esteem is going to dip during the period of puberty. We've talked about the importance of understanding the egocentric mind and the imaginary audience and the personal fable and the invincibility fable. All of these are very important to take into consideration when we look at adolescent behavior and provide support from the family and the fear and the peers. However, sometimes some adolescent might become chronically sad and depressed and fall into what we call a deep depression. Those depressive periods are now going away from that typical moodiness of a teenager into what we consider as a pathological uh, problem and requiring further attention from a psychologist or a specialized a therapist. Um, Deep depression is defined as feelings of hopelessness, lethargy, and worthlessness that continue for more than 2 weeks. Um, the causes can be genetic, and of course, the changes in the body and in the system, but then it could also be triggered by the nurture and what agitates it sometimes can be a relationship that was broken. When we talked about romances and how that girls tend to fall into um, deep depression or into despair more than boys do. As a matter of fact, 1 in 5 girls, in comparison to 1 in 10 boys, fall into that deep depression. One reason given by researchers is the concept of rumination, and that is the repeated thinking and talking about a past experience. And the more we talk about it, the more we kind of relive it again emotionally and psychologically. So this contributes to depression and is more common in girls who tend to want to talk about it versus boys who usually are not as talkative as girls are. Um, of course, there's also, unfortunately, the incidence of suicide, and sometimes that is a byproduct of deep depression that has gone unattended. Suicidal ideation is a serious and very important problem that can affect the teenager and needs to be taken seriously because it is a thought of killing oneself. So it's still in the thinking process. So having a suicidal ideation, meaning that you have explored the idea in your mind, and it is most common at about age 15 and can lead to what we call parasuicide, and that is actually attempting to kill oneself. So, parasuicide is any potentially lethal action against oneself that did not result in death. So, it's a parasuicide, meaning that the suicide did not happen. It tends to be more common in boys than in girls. Boys tend to kill themselves 4 times more than girls, and the methods usually are um, um, different than the ones that girls do. Um, Parasuicide is common, however, we cannot really consider it an epidemic. Complete suicides are very rare. As a matter of fact, one statistic shows that there is 8 complete suicides per 100,000 adolescence. Now, of course, this is eight too many, but this is important to take into consideration when we talk about how widely spread this problem is amongst teenagers. Um, Adolescents tend to be more affected by the coverage of a suicide, especially given the fact that we have social media now and exaggerating sometimes and continuous coverage of a particular accident. So when teenagers view those traumatic experiences, sometimes it triggers cluster suicide, which is several teenagers attempting to commit suicide by members, um, but at the same time within a short period of one occurrence. Another important part of development during this time is uh, the fact that teenagers tend to experiment with breaking the law. And this is a byproduct of them experimenting with, pushing boundaries and taking a stance or rebellions. So the prevalence and the incidence of criminal actions tend to be high during this period of testing authority. Boys, of course, are more overtly aggressive than girls. This, of course, doesn't necessarily come because of their nature, but rather because of the nurture as well. We tend to condition boys to become more aggressive and accept their aggressive behavior from early age. And we tend to report boys' aggressiveness than we do with girls. Take, for example, if a teenager was aggressive with their parent, chances are a father or a mother is more um, uh, prone to call the cops on her teenage son than she would on her teenage daughter, and a father might be prone to call police on their son that they would on their daughter. So that aggressiveness is kind of it might start as a nature, but it's also supported by the way our society views males versus females actions. Many adolescents have broken the law but have not been caught. And on the same page, we need to take into consideration that because of that highly developed limbic system and that impulsive behavior, adolescents might actually say that they committed a crime or voluntarily take blame for an incident in order to protect someone else, a girlfriend or a parent or a member of their family. Researchers distinguish between two types of teenage lawbreakers. One is the adolescent limited offender, and those are the ones that are usually inclined to break the law because of that deviancy of their friends. So within the peer group, they tend to break the law, and once they kind of grow out of it, by age 21, they stop doing things like that. However, the other type is what is called a life course persistent offender, and these are the ones that are more inclined to do the harm or break the law even when they are alone. And they continue to break the law, and regardless if they are alone or with as part of a gang. And chances are you will find some sort of a neurological impairment, and they will be kind of the product of a continuous problem that happened in early childhood, and they continue to go undetected and grow up to become, I want to say, career criminals. Drug use and abuse is something that is very common also around this period of development. Most adolescents experiment with drugs, especially alcohol and tobacco. And all of these drugs have proven statistically that they are very harmful, particularly during the period of adolescence. Remember, this is the period when the brain is restructuring itself, and there's a lot of neurological pruning that's taking place. And those drugs have a direct effect on the development of the brain and impulse control that's already hyperactive. So we see a lot of influence uh, uh, on the support system. So the age of the adolescent, the gender, the community, and the parental support have an influence on when do they experiment with it and how long do they experiment with it and whether they are harmed by it. The widespread and frequency of drug abuse is starting to go down. Usually it peaks between 10 and 25, but we're seeing a trend of less and less adolescent experimenting with drugs, particularly alcohol and tobacco, especially with tobacco becoming such a having a negative view in the minds of adolescents. You know, smoking is considered something not desirable. What's replacing that, unfortunately, there is a dramatic increase in e-cigarettes or vaping, and that is kind of the new trend in our society that is creating an alarm. Excuse me. What are the successful strategies to kind of curb or stop drug use among teenagers? Well, many efforts to stop it have failed, but overall, there's a positive trend as far as those massive ad campaigns that, by public officials who target and advocate for um, uh, giving a kind of a graphic picture of what a life on drugs can look like, or a person who smokes can look like. Those commercials tend to be effective, and they tend to stick in the minds of adolescents more than anything else that have been, of course, used. And on top of all of this, as always in any problem, parental example and societal changes have a major impact as well. Um, if you grew up in a household where you saw your parent smoke or take drugs, your chances are much higher to experiment with that or follow in their footsteps than if you didn't. And of course, if you are in a society that kind of enforces the rules and the laws on handling of drugs or accessibility or the price, then chances are you're not able to get that as easy as if it was something that is readily available and accessible.